Hello, my name is Timothy Saunders, and in this short video I'm going to be talking about how you might use what I have called a sample revision sheet. The idea here is that you record in as concise a form as possible all the most important features of the text you have studied. This means you should have one of these sheets for every one of the texts on the reading list, at least the longer ones. And its purpose is to give you some prompts so that you would feel more comfortable writing about that text, either in the context of a close reading or as part of a comparison with another text. Now, invariably, how you respond to each individual work of literature, what you think is most important about it, is and should be personal to you. So how you fill in this form is likely to differ from how anybody else would. What is more, what I've given you here is a general framework you might use. But to be honest, it works better for some texts than for others. So I think the point here is that each time you make one of these sheets, you need to shape it in a way that works best for you. And I'd recommend that you try to keep it to no more than one side of A4. So I'm just going to talk briefly through the example I have given here, which is not complete for obvious reasons, but it also relates to the curious incident. Now personally, I find it helpful to start off with a statement about what happened in the book. This is what I have called the situation the work of literature describes. There are many texts on this reading list, and by the time you come to the exam, it's not always as easy as we might think, remembering what happens in each individual text. So here's a chance to just record that, but I would encourage you not to use more than 2 or 3 sentences. What I've written here then is quite simple. A teenager called Christopher tells the story of how he started out investigating the killing of a dog and ended up finding out his mother is still alive and that his father had lied to him. Now that could be enough, that just describes the events, but it can be helpful to summarize what you think the purpose of the story is. So I've suggested that it is a story about how Christopher understands the world, relates to other people, and copes with the challenges with which life presents him. Now the next section is called Key Context. Now this is a case where in the curious incident this isn't all that important, but some of the texts we'll be talking about do belong to important context. Some texts have very important historical context, whether it's the First World War, for example, or the Second World War. Or there may be something important about the author, his or her political beliefs, for example, their upbringing, where they come from, whether they're a man or a woman, these kinds of things. Now, as I said, personally I don't think any of this is especially important for the curious incident, but it's certainly very important for some of the other texts on the reading list. Now we come to key themes. This is, in short, what we think the work of literature is about, what its main topics are, but also if it maintains a position on those topics. For example, one could have a book about religion, a book about Christian faith, but it could be a book that either praises it or criticizes it. So that's the sort of thing we mean by theme. Now with the curious incident there are many different themes, and of course I have not covered all of them here, but I've just given you a few to give you some examples. How relationships function and are maintained, how we make sense of ourselves and our world, how we try to create order in our daily lives, the role of language, literature and culture in all those things, and the role of science and maths in helping Christopher achieve those things, helping him achieve relationships, understand himself and the world, and so on. Now, let's imagine that you were set a passage from the curious incident as a close reading option. you would look to see whether any of these themes are discussed in this particular passage, and your focus would be then on how they are presented in that particular passage, but how this contributes to the development of that theme in the novel as a whole. And to reiterate what I said before, the purpose of this sheet is to give you prompts. So you can see, first of all, is there anything to do with a relationship in this passage? A father and a son, a husband and a wife, a teacher and a pupil, for example. You might look whether it has anything to say about science or mathematics, and so on and so forth. And it helps you identify that what's being talked about in the passage you've been given is something that's important to the text as a whole, and this is something you should consider in your close readings. So now we move on to the next section I've suggested, called Key Settings. Now, as with key context, I don't think this is hugely important for the Curious Incident. Obviously the two main settings are Swindon and London, and certainly if you know the sort of topography, the social associations of these places, there is quite a lot of humour here. Swindon is regarded as an extremely boring place to be, for example, so that can add to the humour. It's also suburban, it's small, it's more manageable for someone like Christopher than, say, London is. Having said that, settings in a more abstract sense are important, because how Christopher survives depends on where he is. He doesn't like being trapped with other people in small spaces, but he's a very spatial thinker. When he's trying to work things out, he often draws maps and so on. So as far as this section's concerned, if you were to be set a passage from the Curious Incident, you might consider where it's set. It may or it may not be important, whether he's in a confined space or a more open space, whether he's in a place he knows, whether he's in a place he doesn't know, whether he's locating one thing in relation to another. Remember, the opening of the novel, he's very precise about where the dog Wellington is lying, and he likes to talk about where he is and what the time is. So these are things to look out for too. Very crucial, no matter which text you're talking about, will be key images, motifs and other stylistic features. Now again, how you note these down will be up to you, but with Christopher it's helpful to be reminded that he likes using illustrations, maps, graphs and diagrams. What's more, these are usually very, very clear and orderly and simple, reflecting the way he looks upon the world. So too with his language. This too is often simple and logical. He understands what other people say in a literal sense, and this can generate, for example, some of the humour of the book when people are speaking figuratively or ironically. It's important to think about the first-person narration, how Christopher tells his story. This, of course, is something that is important no matter which chapter we are considering. He writes usually short sentences, and his chapters are generally short too. It helps give a sense of things being kept under control, not too expansive. But it's interesting to see how the chapters are often structured. They often end either with a conclusion, in other words, there's been a problem which has been solved. It could be a mathematical problem he's talking about, or he can end with yet another puzzle. He may have solved part of the mystery and then finds out another. So in the course of trying to discover who kills Wellington, he finds out that his mother is actually still alive. And this, of course, ending with what we call cliffhanger endings, can really draw us into the book and make us really engage with it. But also this tendency to set everything up as a puzzle to be solved is very much how Christopher thinks. So all these things are things you might look out for in a passage for close reading. If you were to be set a passage that included a diagram or a map, you should talk about it. You should talk about the kind of map it is, the kind of diagram it is, how it reflects Christopher's way of thinking, and you can relate then what you see in the specific passage to the strategy of the book as a whole, and consider this as a part of a broader pattern. In keeping with this, it's useful to list some of the key words that you find so that you're ready to circle them if you encounter them. So again, I could have written many more here, but I've taken two sets that I think are very prominent, truth and lies. Basically, this covers all words that have anything to do with these two things. Is it true? Is it false? Are they joking? Are they serious? Are they trustworthy? Are they not trustworthy? You would look through the passage and circle any words that have anything to do with this. Likewise, the connectives such as and then, of which there are many. You would circle them. For example, when and appears at the start of the sentence, you might say, this is typical of Christopher. He likes to line everything up in a row and see everything connected with everything else. This is reflected in his great use of and. Also, he tends to put and at the start of the sentence, as I mentioned, and this is not traditionally correct English grammar, so he's breaking a rule, and this perhaps reflects a sense that Christopher is quite idiosyncratic. He's an individual who doesn't always follow the rules. Now, I haven't filled out the next part, the in conclusion, because I think that's for you to decide for yourselves. And you need to ask yourselves then, how can I answer these three questions very simply? What does this book say? How does it say it? And why does it say what it says and in the way that it does? Because no matter whether it's a close reading or a comparison, these are the questions that in some form you will be expected to answer. To have a clear line on that in relation to each text will be very helpful for you. The last point is primarily for the comparison. You may be given a question such as compare and contrast the way in which two texts use a first-person narrator. So then you need obviously to find two texts that have this narrator. Now this is just a brief survey. All I can really recommend that you do from this point is start making your own revision sheets for the texts on the course, filling them out after you've completed each lesson on that text. And then once you've done so, just open the book at random, find a random paragraph, and use your notes to try and see if that will help you make a close reading. And if it doesn't, then you may need to rethink the way you've done your revision sheet, but hopefully you'll find that it really does help. It gives you some prompts, some shorthand that can enable you to work up more swiftly a detailed, interesting and coherent close reading.